17,000 civilizations had managed to coexist in the galactic convergence without massacring each other for approximately 800 standard cycles, which was either a testament to diplomatic genius or collective exhaustion. Most sentient species leaned toward the latter explanation, though nobody said it out. According to YouTube analytics, 98% of viewers are not subscribed. That's a huge number. By subscribing the channel that is completely free, you'll help support the channel and never miss fresh content. Loud during official functions. The architecture of interstellar politics resembled a three-dimensional chess game played by beings who couldn't agree on which dimension counted as up. At the top of this magnificent disaster sat the Arbitration Collective, a governing body composed of representatives from the 12 oldest spacefaring species. They made decisions with the speed of continental drift and the flexibility of crystallized iron. Below them sprawled the Council of Representatives, which included everyone else who'd figured out faster-than-light travel and hadn't immediately blown themselves up afterward. Humans had joined this circus approximately 40 cycles ago, which meant they were still considered the annoying newcomers who showed up to the party without understanding the dress code. Most species maintained a diplomatic distance, observing these peculiar primates with the wariness typically reserved for unexploded ordnance. Humans had earned this reputation honestly, mostly by doing things that made absolutely no sense to anyone else and somehow surviving the consequences. The Kathrani occupied a very different position in galactic society. They'd been members of the Arbitration Collective for 600 cycles, which granted them the authority to look down their elongated snouts at practically everyone. They resembled what would happen if someone took a terrestrial wolf, stretched it to 7 feet tall, gave it opposable thumbs and an insufferable superiority complex, then draped it in enough ceremonial fabric to outfit a small circus. Their fur ranged from deep auburn to silver gray, and they moved with a predatory grace that reminded other species why fear existed as an evolutionary adaptation. But the Kathrani's true influence stemmed from their control of the Hesper Corridor, a region of space containing enough rare minerals to make economists weep with joy. They'd defended this territory through 3 separate wars, each time demonstrating why their military academies were considered the finest in known space. Other civilizations needed their resources. The Kathrani knew it. Everyone knew they knew it. This knowledge informed every interaction with the tedious predictability of gravity. Their culture revolved around protocols so complex they made quantum mechanics look like basic arithmetic. Every gesture carried meaning. Every word choice signaled intent. They'd codified social interaction into an art form that required years of study to avoid accidentally starting a blood feud. Other species generally coped by hiring Kathrani cultural consultants or avoiding them entirely. The most sacred aspect of Kathrani society involved their offspring. Cubs represented not just biological continuity, but the literal embodiment of ancestral honor and future legacy. The protocols surrounding them could fill libraries. Who could touch a cub, under what circumstances, using which hand, during which lunar phase? All of this mattered with an intensity that baffled most other species. Break these protocols, and you'd find yourself on the receiving end of consequences that made diplomatic incidents look like pleasant misunderstandings. Which brought us to the current situation, unfolding in the neutral space station designated Convergence Point 7. The peace treaty negotiations between the Kathrani hegemony and the Erythian Collective had been stalled for 8 months. Both sides wanted access to a disputed star system that contained strategic resources and occupied an inconveniently strategic location. Neither side could afford open warfare, but neither could afford to be seen backing down. So they'd been dancing around each other in conference rooms, generating enough paperwork to deforest a small planet, if anyone still used paper. The Arbitration Collective had finally lost patience and insisted on human mediation. This decision made about as much sense as appointing a toddler to perform surgery, but the logic went like this. Humans were new enough to lack historical alliances with either party, crazy enough that both sides would behave to avoid unpredictable human reactions, and apparently stubborn enough to sit through months of tedious negotiation without developing a drinking problem. 2 out of 3 of these assumptions were incorrect, but nobody had asked the humans about that part. The human diplomat arrived on a Tuesday, which meant nothing to most species, but seemed to amuse her. She stood roughly 5.5 feet tall, which made her shorter than most sapient species, and taller than the rest. Her skin was a medium brown that deepened in certain lights, and her hair was pulled back in a style that probably had a name, but looked like organized chaos. She wore a fitted suit in dark blue that managed to be both professional and completely wrong for every cultural context simultaneously. She'd introduced herself with a name that sounded like broken glass tumbling downstairs. Most species just mentally filed her under the human and moved on. Her credentials were impressive if you cared about that sort of thing. Advanced degrees in xenopsychology, conflict resolution, and something called comparative anthropology that appeared to be the study of how different species managed not to kill each other. She'd mediated 7 previous disputes, with a success rate that was either lucky or competent, depending on who you asked. The Kathrani ambassador had greeted her arrival with the enthusiasm typically reserved for intestinal parasites. His name translated roughly to honored voice of the third mountain clan under the silver moon, but the human just called him ambassador, which probably counted as either an insult or blessed simplicity. He was a massive specimen even by Kathrani standards, his fur a distinguished silver that denoted age and status. He wore ceremonial armor that was more art than protection, etched with his family history in scripts so old that half the linguists in the galaxy couldn't read them. The Orithian representative was less visually impressive, but no less dangerous. The Orithians were silicon-based life forms who looked like someone had taught crystals to walk upright and hold grudges. They communicated through frequency modulation that required translation software, and they approached conflict with the patient inexorability of erosion. Their representative had been on the station for 9 months and showed no signs of degradation, discomfort, or basic fatigue. Humans found this deeply unsettling. The human diplomat had reviewed the situation with what could only be described as barely concealed horror, masked by professional politeness. 8 months of negotiations had produced a draft treaty with more holes than a sponge and enough ambiguous language to justify whatever interpretation suited either party. The core issues remained unresolved. Both sides had dug into positions that made trench warfare look flexible. "This is going well," she'd muttered to herself in her quarters after the first day of orientation, which was human sarcasm so thick you could spread it on toast. The mediation was scheduled to take place in Conference Chamber 7, a space designed to accommodate multiple species simultaneously while offending all of them equally. The lighting was wrong for everyone. The temperature was uncomfortable for most. The furniture existed in a state of compromise that made it useless for everyone. Humans called this diplomatic neutral ground. Everyone else called it unnecessarily unpleasant. What nobody had mentioned in the briefing materials, what hadn't appeared in any of the preparatory documents, was that the Kathrani ambassador had brought his cubs to the station. This was unprecedented, shocking. The kind of thing that made career diplomats choke on their beverages. Cubs never left Kathrani home, worlds except under the most extraordinary circumstances. They certainly never appeared in diplomatic venues. The decision spoke to either the ambassador's supreme confidence or his profound disrespect for everyone present. Possibly both. The 2 cubs were perhaps 3 standard cycles old, covered in downy russet fur that would darken as they aged. They possessed the oversized paws and ears that marked young Kathrani, and they watched the world with eyes that reflected light in unsettling ways. During formal sessions, they remained with their caretakers in private quarters. But the station was small enough that paths crossed. Other delegates had seen them. Word spread with the velocity of gossip, which was faster than light travel by several orders of magnitude. The human diplomat had encountered them exactly once before the incident, passing through a corridor as the caretakers moved them to different quarters. She'd stopped, made some soft noise in her throat, and said something in her own language that the translator rendered as, "Oh my goodness, look at the puppies." The caretakers had frozen with expressions that suggested she'd just announced her intention to detonate the station. One of them had made a sharp gesture that clearly meant, "Keep walking and never speak of this." The human had complied, though she'd looked back twice with an expression the Kathrani couldn't quite interpret. That should have been the end of it. A minor cultural fumble by an ignorant newcomer, easily forgotten. Nobody could have predicted what would happen when the negotiations reached their breaking point 3 weeks later. Nobody could have anticipated the cascade of events that would fundamentally alter how the galaxy viewed humanity. And absolutely nobody expected the whole thing to hinge on something as simple as water and the way one species could offer it to another. The negotiation chamber on day 23 of human mediation had the atmosphere of a funeral where everyone hated the deceased. The Kathrani ambassador sat rigid in his ceremonial posture, radiating disapproval like a miniature sun radiated heat. Across from him, the Orithian representative pulsed with frequencies that the translators kept rendering as immovable object meets immovable object. The human diplomat had been speaking for approximately 7 minutes about water rights in the disputed system when the door to the adjacent observation room burst open. A Kathrani caretaker stumbled through, fur standing on end, closely followed by the 2 cubs. The youngsters were making sounds that bypassed language entirely and went straight to the brainstem, triggering every species' instinctive recognition of distress. High-pitched keening that oscillated in ways that made everyone present deeply uncomfortable. The ambassador was on his feet instantly, moving with speed that reminded everyone he'd been a warrior before becoming a diplomat. He reached for the cubs, but they dodged around him, still making those awful sounds. The caretaker was speaking rapidly in formal Kathrani, words tumbling over each other about malfunction and water systems, and apologies that carried the weight of potential execution. The cubs were dehydrated. Not dangerously so, not yet, but enough that their young bodies were screaming about it. The station's water recycling system in their quarters had failed 6 hours ago, and nobody had noticed until the damage was done. The ambassador barked orders. 3 different species jumped to help, their diplomatic training kicking in despite the chaos. A Vrexian delegate produced a water container from somewhere, offering it with appendages that trembled slightly. The cubs recoiled, pressing against each other, their keening, intensifying. Protocol. Even in distress, the cubs knew the protocols. Water from strangers, water from non-Kathrani, water offered incorrectly, all forbidden. Their young minds couldn't override cycles of cultural conditioning, even as their bodies desperately needed hydration. The Orithian representative attempted to help, modulating frequencies meant to be soothing. The cubs only cried harder, overwhelmed by the additional sensory input. A Teluvian ambassador tried approaching with water in a formal vessel, speaking the correct ritual phrases. The cubs wouldn't even look at it. The human diplomat had been standing motionless, watching this unfold with an expression that cycled through concern, understanding, and something that might have been resignation. She moved then, not toward the cubs, but toward the refreshment station at the chamber's edge. She picked up a simple container, filled it with water, and walked back with movements that were deliberately slow and non-threatening. She didn't speak, didn't announce her intentions, just lowered herself to a crouch about 6 feet from the cubs, holding the container in both hands. Then she did something that made every Kathrani in the room go absolutely still. She cupped water in her bare hands and held them out, letting liquid pool in her palms. The cubs stopped keening. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise. Every being in that chamber held whatever they used for breath. The smaller cub moved first, taking one hesitant step forward, then another. Its nose twitched, processing scents and signals that only Kathrani biology could detect. The larger cub followed, the two of them approaching in that careful way. Young predators moved toward something they couldn't quite classify. They reached the human's outstretched hands, sniffed once, twice. Then they lowered their heads and drank. The ambassador made a sound that no translator in the chamber could properly render. It emerged from somewhere deep in his chest, bypassing language entirely to communicate shock at a frequency that made several species' auditory organs ache. His claws, which had been carefully retracted throughout 3 weeks of negotiations, extended fully. For approximately 4 seconds, everyone in the room calculated their odds of surviving if he decided violence was the appropriate response. He didn't attack. He simply stood there, watching his cubs drink from the hands of an alien species, doing something that violated roughly 600 cycles of cultural protocol. The cubs finished the water, looked up at the human with expressions that somehow managed to be both predatory and trusting, and made small chirping sounds that meant they wanted more. The human refilled her cupped hands. The cubs drank again. The Kathrani caretaker had gone completely rigid, fur standing straight up in a display that indicated either terror or religious ecstasy. Possibly both. The other delegates in the room were equally frozen, though their reasons varied from diplomatic self-preservation to genuine anthropological fascination to simple inability to process what they were witnessing. The human offered water 3 more times. The cubs accepted each offering. Their distress completely vanished. When they'd finally had enough, they did something that made the ambassador's expression cycle through 12 different emotions in rapid succession. They pressed their small bodies against the human's legs and closed their eyes in contentment. The larger cub started purring. If the first part had been shocking, this was apocalyptic. Cubs didn't purr for anyone outside their immediate family group until they reached maturity. It was a sound of absolute trust, of safety, of pack bonding. The human looked down at them with an expression of pleased confusion, clearly not understanding the magnitude of what was happening, but happy about it anyway. The ambassador finally found words. They came out in formal High Kathrani, the kind used for religious ceremonies and declarations of war. The translator struggled for a moment before rendering them as something like, "Explain this impossibility immediately, or I will require explanations that involve significantly more violence." The human looked up at him, cubs still pressed against her legs. "I gave them water. They were thirsty." This answer satisfied nobody. The Kathrani cultural expert was summoned from elsewhere on the station, arriving at a dead run that suggested someone had communicated the severity of the situation. She was an elderly female, fur gone silver with age, who'd spent 200 cycles studying every aspect of Kathrani protocol. She stopped in the doorway, assessed the scene, and made a gesture that roughly translated to, "Well, that's all my research invalidated in one moment." The questioning began immediately. A dozen species wanted to understand what had just occurred, each for their own reasons. The Kathrani needed to know if their most sacred protocols had been violated or transcended. Other delegates saw a potential advantage in understanding this unexpected connection. The station's xenobiologists wanted tissue samples and brain scans, and probably would have requested to vivisect everyone involved if they thought they could get away with it. The human submitted to this interrogation with patience that seemed nearly infinite, though her answers were frustratingly simple. No, she hadn't studied Kathrani cub protocols beyond basic awareness they existed. No, she hadn't performed any special ritual. No, she didn't know why cupped hands worked when proper vessels failed. Yes, she'd just acted on instinct because small beings in distress triggered human caretaking responses. Yes, she realized this was probably diplomatically significant, but could someone please explain why everyone looked like she'd just rewritten physics? The cultural expert provided that explanation in a voice that shook slightly. Cubs only accepted Water from pack. Pack meant family, meant blood connection, meant bonds that took cycles to establish through elaborate protocols. The human had no connection, should have been rejected instantly, should have been impossible for the cubs to even consider accepting water from her, let alone initiating physical contact afterward. Someone suggested pheromones. Humans produced enough chemical signals to confuse a laboratory. Perhaps something in her scent had tricked the cubs' biology. Tests were run. Results came back negative. Human pheromones bore no resemblance to Kathrani markers. Someone else proposed electromagnetic fields. Humans generated weak bioelectric signals. Maybe those had somehow interfaced with Kathrani neural patterns. More tests, more negative results. The fields were too weak, too different, completely incompatible with Kathrani sensory systems. A Tuluvian biologist suggested quantum entanglement, which was the universal fallback explanation when nothing else made sense. Everyone ignored this because quantum entanglement was always the suggestion when nothing else made sense, and it was never actually quantum entanglement. The human sat through all of this with decreasing patience, occasionally glancing at the cubs who'd been returned to their caretakers but kept looking back at her with interest that made the Kathrani deeply uncomfortable. Finally, she interrupted a particularly elaborate theory about resonant frequency matching with a question that cut through the academic speculation like a knife through vapor. Did any of you actually ask the cubs what made the difference? The silence that followed this question was profound. 17 species, hundreds of advanced degrees, technology that could fold space like paper, and not one of them had considered asking the cubs directly. The Kathrani didn't have translation technology for pre-verbal youngsters. Nobody did. Cubs communicated through instinct and emotion until language development completed around age 7. Except humans apparently had developed something close. They called it reading body language and claimed it was a survival trait from their evolutionary history. The human diplomat had been doing it unconsciously from the moment the cubs entered the room. She explained what she'd observed, and the Kathrani cultural expert listened with an expression that suggested her entire worldview was crumbling in real time. The cubs had been overwhelmed. Too many species, too many sounds, too many protocols being thrown at them while their bodies screamed for water. Every attempt to help had added more complexity when they needed simplicity. The human had offered water in cupped hands, because that's what humans did for small animals in distress. No ceremony, no protocol, no vessels or formal gestures, just water and hands, and an intent that even young cubs could read clearly. Here is help, uncomplicated and immediate. The cubs had responded to that clarity, to the absence of complexity. To an offering so simple their instincts could override their cultural conditioning because it didn't trigger any of the warning systems protocol existed to activate. It was the most human solution possible. Ignore the rules everyone else was following and just do the obvious thing. The treaty negotiations resumed 6 hours later. The atmosphere had changed in ways that defied conventional diplomatic analysis. The Kathrani ambassador kept watching the human with an expression that cycled between respect and deeply troubling uncertainty. The cubs had been checked by medical staff, declared healthy, and returned to their quarters. They'd cried when separated from the human, which had required another hour of explanation and cultural counseling. The disputed star system was divided along lines the human proposed, which somehow gave both sides exactly what they actually needed while denying them what they'd claimed they wanted. The treaty was signed before the end of the cycle. Both parties left satisfied in ways they couldn't quite articulate. The human diplomat prepared to depart the station, her assignment complete. The Kathrani ambassador requested a private meeting before her departure. This was unusual but not unprecedented. What he said during that meeting would remain private, but he emerged looking like someone who'd had a religious experience and wasn't sure whether to be grateful or terrified. The cubs insisted on being present for the human's departure. Protocol suggested this was inappropriate. The ambassador overruled protocol, which itself was unprecedented enough to generate 3 academic papers before the human's transport had even left dock range. The youngsters pressed against her legs one final time, purring in a way that made their caretakers look faint. The human scratched behind their ears, which was probably another protocol violation, and told them to be good. They watched her leave with expressions that suggested they were memorizing everything about her. The galaxy took note. The academic papers started appearing within weeks. 17 different disciplines wanted to explain what had happened in Conference Chamber 7, each theory more elaborate than the last. Xenopsychologists wrote treatises about cross-species empathy recognition. Evolutionary biologists proposed frameworks for understanding convergent caretaking instincts. Diplomats crafted entire new theories about the nature of trust and protocol. They were all probably overthinking it, but that had never stopped academics before. The Kathrani hegemony updated their cultural guidelines for the first time in 400 cycles. A single line was added to the protocols surrounding cubs. Exceptions may exist in cases of genuine emergency when traditional methods prove inadequate. It was the most diplomatic way possible to say, apparently humans can do things we thought were impossible, and we're still processing that information. Human diplomats suddenly found themselves in unprecedented demand for negotiations involving the Kathrani. This was either a tremendous honor or a cosmic joke, depending on whether you asked the humans or everyone else. The humans approached these assignments with their characteristic mixture of competence and barely suppressed panic. The cubs grew, as cubs do. They reached maturity and entered diplomatic service themselves, because apparently the universe enjoyed irony. They specialized in human relations, naturally. Both of them developed reputations for being unusually flexible with protocol, which their elders viewed with either concern or relief depending on the day. The incident spawned an entire subdiscipline of diplomatic study called spontaneous protocol adaptation, which was academic speak for sometimes you need to throw out the rule book and wing it. Universities across 12-star systems offered courses on the subject. Students debated endlessly whether the human's actions represented genius or blind luck. The professors, who were generally wiser, suggested it was probably both. Trade agreements between humanity and the Kathrani hegemony increased by 300% over the following decade. Whether this was because of improved relations or because the Kathrani were hedging their bets on a species that could apparently rewrite social rules through sheer audacity remained unclear. Economic analysts leaned toward the latter explanation, though they phrased it more diplomatically in their reports. Other species began reconsidering their assumptions about humans. Perhaps these newcomers weren't just lucky survivors of their own chaos. Perhaps there was method in their apparent madness, a kind of adaptive flexibility that came from evolving on a world that had tried very hard to kill them for millions of years. When your home planet spent epochs throwing extinction events at you, apparently you learned to think on your feet. They never forgot the human who'd given them water when they needed it. Memory became story, story became legend, and legend became the kind of thing that got referenced in diplomatic circles when people needed an example of how first contact could go unexpectedly right. 17,000 civilizations continued coexisting in the galactic convergence, with varying degrees of success. The humans remained unpredictable, continuing their pattern of ignoring established protocol and somehow making it work. Other species learned to anticipate this behavior, which paradoxically made it more effective. The lesson, if there was one, seemed to be this. Sometimes the most complex problems required the simplest solutions. Sometimes centuries of protocol mattered less than basic kindness. Sometimes the newcomers who didn't know the rules could teach the old powers something about flexibility. And sometimes, when beings were thirsty, you just needed to offer them water in your hands and trust that basic compassion transcended cultural boundaries. The galaxy was still learning this. The humans, characteristically, had known it all along.